Hi y'all, I'm Chengcheng and I want to focus on translanguaging and its relationships with this week's some other keywords. So what is translanguaging? Translanguaging was first brought up by Ken Williams in the 1980s that it was a practice of deliberately changing the language of input and the language of output. Garcia argued in her 2009 article that translanguagings are multiple discursive practices in which bilinguals engage in order to make sense of their bilingual world. So the focus here is about making meaning. Translanguaging can also empower students to construct their linguistic and cultural identities in a creative and critical way. During this process, intertextuality also happens. Students are actively comparing the differences between texts in different languages. Their interpretation to a certain text is influenced by other texts, which will eventually enhance their understandings of different languages. Translanguaging is different from code-switching language practices and language socialization because it is essentially about making meaning to go beyond code-switching, translation, and simple language practices and to construct students' own understandings. As Garcia says in her 2011 article, translanguaging refers to the process by which bilingual students perform bilingually in a myriad multimodal ways of classrooms, reading, writing, taking notes, discussing, signing, etc. Translanguaging can also avoid register stereotypes, such as meta-pragmatic stereotypes. Instead of being taught that something is slang, is polite, is used by older people, students are making the comparisons by themselves. So why do we need a translanguaging lens on education? To start with, there are two perspectives on languages, namely internal perspective of a speaker and external societal perspective. From external societal perspective, there are always dominant languages. For individuals, there are always language 1, language 2, which refers to the language they are most fluent in. But internal perspective of a speaker gets rid of language hierarchy and returns the power to a speaker. There is no absolute dominant language, so that students can be liberated and empowered as they can now use almost all of their linguistic and cultural knowledge to perform better and compete better in classrooms compared with monolingual students. So translanguaging goes with the internal perspective of a speaker. Trans is reflected in three aspects. There are trans-system and trans-space. There are also transformative nature of translanguaging. Finally, there are transdisciplinary consequences of the languaging and education analysis. Translanguaging can also help promote social justice. As Garcia argued, beyond the inclusion of different language practices, translanguaging opens up a space of resistance and social justice, since language practices of minorized use are usually racialized and stigmatized. To better facilitate students' natural translanguaging, teachers may conduct official translanguaging by helping students to make meaning of language practices. Teachers are also expected to be a detective, an architect, a lifeguard, and a transformer. Translanguaging space refers to a space where students can construct their own messages. There are three elements to translanguaging classrooms, namely stance, design, and shift. The emphasis is juntos, which means together in Spanish. Translanguaging helps students to go beyond the named languages to construct a unified identity. Garcia also mentioned that translanguaging should not be viewed as a scaffold. It is a way for students to construct their own understandings in a creative and critical way. The translanguaging pedagogy used in the experimental curriculum developed by Kano in 2010 is that Japanese students can compare the same texts but written in both Japanese and English, so that they can compare the differences and have a better understanding of the English written system. There are 3 steps to her example. So first, students read bilingual texts on the topic about which they were assigned to write. Second, they discuss the bilingual readings mostly in Japanese. And finally, they wrote an essay in English on the topic of the bilingual reading and a discussion in Japanese about the readings. There are some challenges to translanguaging as a pedagogy as well. So there are 2 challenges that I identify in our readings. So the firstly is about H and L languages. English as an international language has many varieties, so there are many Englishes which can cause difficulty in understanding for students when having bilingual or multilingual classes. Also, there are different registers of a certain language in society. There are just too many registers for students to master, but maybe the question is, should they master? What is the definition of master? And these are my questions for you to consider. Thank you very much for listening.